You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Sabah al-Khair, good morning dear listeners. You're listening to Radio 3CR on 855 AM and Palestine Remembered with Robert Martin, Nasser Mashni and Yusuf Ahmed al-Rimawi.
Palestine Remembered is Australia's only English language radio program that is totally dedicated to Palestine. We'd like to welcome those listening on 855 and those that will join us on podcast at 3cr.org.au.
Thanks for joining us. Stay with us and enjoy the episode.
Good morning, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Palestine Remembered today. Those that have been listening to the show will be now preparing for our conference, the day 2 of the Palestine Solidarity Conference there at Trades Hall. One of our guests and guests of honour to the conference, but also a superb Palestinian and a guest to our shores, is Professor Mazin Qumsiyeh, who is a Palestinian scientist and author. He's the founder and director of the Palestine Museum of Natural History and the Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability at Bethlehem University, where he teaches. He's published over 150 scientific papers on topics ranging from cultural heritage to biodiversity, in addition to several books. He also serves on the board of a number of Palestinian youth and service organisations. The standard CV for a Palestinian underachiever, Professor. You know, there's a joke that says, as a Palestinian, you can be a doctor, a dentist, a lawyer, or a failure. So welcome. You're obviously you're not a failure. Thank you for coming to Australia and gracing us with your presence.
It's a great honor to be here in the land of Aboriginal people, and I honor them and I honor you for doing what you are doing.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. One of the big parts of, the best parts since October 7 has been an increase in understanding of our community as Australian Palestinians, of, in fact, the connection between the Indigenous struggle here and the fact that we actually represent settlers, that, we have taken advantage of an Indigenous land and Indigenous people. And we do want to pay respects to our Indigenous brothers here and sisters, and know that our fight is their fight and their fight isn't our fight. And whilst we always talk about Palestine being free from the river to the sea, this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Professor, tell us in a couple of minutes your Nakba story, your family story.
So my family is from Bethlehem, although one of my grandparents is from Nazareth. My mother's best friend in school was Hayab al-Bisi. They were both basically 17 years old when the Nakba happened. And Hayab al-Bisi was a teacher as my mother. They were going to the same teacher school in Jerusalem. And Hayab al-Bisi is from Dar Yassin and was killed with her students basically in Dar Yassin massacre in April 1948. And I lost my mother last year, and she even remembered Hayab al-Bisi on her deathbed. So that has always stayed with me as to the matter of luck that my mother survived the Nakba, but Hayab al-Bisi, her friend, did not. And then we, of course, lived with the refugees who came to Bethlehem. There are 3 refugee camps in Bethlehem. And I remember my mother and family helping some of the refugees in Bethlehem. And I have been a lifelong advocate for Palestine from my childhood, basically, and for Palestinian people and also Palestinian nature.
It's a beautiful thing. We were talking on the drive here, Professor, of, a life well lived, that, rather than being a sheep.
Indeed, I mean, our destiny as Palestinians is to live under the suppression that has now gone on for generations. and not as long as what Aboriginals in this country have, which I'm visiting now, what's so-called Australia. But this is our destiny. Our destiny is to live this life. And how we live it and what we choose to do with our limited time on earth as individuals is always something that we have to reflect on. And I think those of us who choose a life of activism, a life of resistance, a life of positive engagement with our surroundings, and we find it a fulfilling life, no matter what the odds are against us, of course. So I choose, for example, to return from the U.S. to Palestine in 2008, even though life in the U.S. financially was very successful. I left personally six-figure income in medical schools in the U.S. I came back to Palestine in 2008, that's 16 years ago, and came back to a zero-figure income, and that was the best decision I made in my life. I find that, our sanity and our mind is, and our abilities are sometimes higher than what we think. And we should pursue our life, a life of engagement, basically, not disconnecting.
It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. Professor, tell us a little bit about your work. One of the, and we'll talk about biodiversity in that space, but one of the things that the Zionists tell us is about their indigeneity. Yeah, their indigeneity, as opposed to, us as interlopers. If you can reflect on our indigeneity, but also your work around biodiversity.
I'm also a historian. I read and look at the old literature and what's written. I'm a medical geneticist. I know human populations and their genetics. My genetics and Palestinian genetics, if I take DNA from you, for example, and compare it to the DNA from bones of Canaanites a few thousand years ago, you'll find identical descent, basically, from these ancestors. So we are, the Palestinians, by and large, with very little admixture from nearby areas. By and large, we Palestinians are the Canaanites. We are also descendant from the first humans that migrated out of Africa about 100,000 years ago, settled in that land, and this population had a continuity there. Once humans developed agriculture about 12,000 years ago, they went from hunter-gatherers to agricultural communities in what is called the Fertile Crescent. And that's, the archaeologists refer to this as the Natufian period that started around 12,000 years ago after Wadi Natuf in the West Bank, actually, in Palestine. The Natufian period, or the period of agriculture, allowed our people to basically settle down, create villages and towns. And we see the continuity of this. For example, Jericho is 12,000 years old of continuous inhabitation. So these are the people of the land. Now, of course, that some of them converted to other religions, became others. So we have indigenous Palestinians who are Christian, Muslim, and yes, also Jewish indigenous Palestinians, about 3% of the population. Now, Jews from Europe and other parts of the world are, of course, not indigenous to Palestine. Like Christians of Europe or Muslims of Europe, they have converted to these religions throughout the ages and acquired different religions, and they are European. So European Jews are, by and large, genetically European. Some of them chose to take the religious connection to Palestine and create from that political ideology called Zionism, in the same fashion that some European Christians took the Christian connections to Palestine and create an idea called crusaderism, and came to Palestine as invaders and crusaders. This was in the 12th century. So we have those ideologies, and we have to distinguish ideologies, political ideologies, from the reality of indigenous people and what their lived experiences and their history. So I think it's very clear that Palestine, which was multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious, and even multilingual society before 1948, included the indigenous people of Palestine, regardless of their religion. The idea of Zionism, a political idea like crusaderism, is an idea of ethnic cleansing, an idea of colonialism, an idea of imperialism, and its practice on the ground meant the displacement of our people, meant the genocide of our people, which has been incremental since 1948, but has become an accelerated genocide since October 2023, with 15,000 children already killed in 6 months or 7 months now in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank.
Yeah. Really profound, and thank you for taking us on that deep dive history. And we say, Jericho, the longest continually inhabited city on earth, and for people who will one day visit a free Palestine and maybe in occupied Palestine, you should go along to see that. It's really an amazing space. Professor, tell us about your work. I mean, you gave up 6 figures as medical scientists in the United States, went back to zero in the West Bank. It took 15 years for your wife to get a Hawiyah, Palestinian. It's an Israeli-issued Palestinian ID document which gives residency.
Right. Yeah, my own story is very simple, and it's one of 15 million Palestinians. I mean, we are 15 million people around the world. Unfortunately, 8 million of us are refugees or displaced people, and the rest live in those shrinking cantons. I live in the shrinking canton of Bethlehem. This canton can be called concentration camp or ghetto or Bantustan in the language of South Africa, or I like to call it people warehouse. It's to store the unwanted people that the colonizers come. They want the land. They don't want the people who come with the land. So they store them in shrinking ghettos like Gaza and Ramallah and Jericho and Bethlehem. So my family is from that shrinking canton or ghetto Bethlehem. And my own story is very simple. I loved biology. I loved nature since my childhood. And of course, under normal circumstances, that would mean a flourishing career in biodiversity studies. But being a Palestinian meant also that I had to do a lot of activism, as you mentioned. Being Palestinian mean you have to become a spokesman and an activist for Palestine because of the nature of your oppression. So I became an activist, and I tried to marry the two things. Have the activism for human rights, the activism for nature. And it turns out the two are connected deeply at a very deep level, because when we said the colonizers want to disconnect people from the land, it's not just that. They also want to reshape the land to suit their own interest. So they damage the landscape, they damage the ecology, they damage the environment. And there's plenty of evidence on this. And I wanted to research it and study and use that knowledge to resist this destruction of our environment. For example, in addition to a genocide of our people, there's an ecocide of our environment. The ecocide is perhaps even more long-term destructive than the genocide, because once you make a land uninhabitable, it's uninhabitable. Destruction of Gaza, for example, is is making it such that it may not be inhabitable again. The destruction of the water aquifer, destruction of all living trees and agricultural fields, a leveling of 70% of the residential buildings in the Gaza Strip. That's homes to 2.3 million Palestinians there, even though 70% of them are actually refugees from 1948. So this ecocide that is ongoing, a diversion of the waters of the Jordan River, the drying of the wetlands of the Hula area, all of this had long-term impact, scarring the landscape. And I started to use a few years ago a term, I call it environmental nakba. Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic, and we had the catastrophe of the destruction of our society beginning in 1948, which didn't stop, it continues to this day. But there's also an environmental nakba that started actually before 1948 with the British introducing Zionism in Palestine and expounding it and helping the Zionists destroy our environment. So this environmental nakba is now about 100 years in the making. And this is what drives me to work on these issues and to connect the ecocide with the genocide, and more importantly, to think of ways how we resist both, how we reshape our reality, how we have, as local people, we have agency, we can affect a change in our circumstances, and we do.
You're joined by Professor Mazin Qumsiyeh, who's here on a tour from Palestine. Don't forget the rally tomorrow. We're just going to play a couple of announcements and then we'll be back with the professor.
What's taking place in Palestine is horrendous. The people of Gaza, who have survived ethnic cleansing, 3 wars and a 16-year siege, are now facing the biggest attacks ever mounted against them.
This will only stop if governments like ours demand that it stop. Here are some ways that you can keep yourself informed and involved.
Listen in to Palestine Remembered every Saturday morning at 9:30 a.m. or listen to the podcast.
Join the APAN mailing list at apan.org.au for updates, news about actions you can get involved in, and where you can donate to provide humanitarian assistance.
Listen to other news and current affairs programs on 3CR that also cover Palestine.
The oppression of the Palestinian people has been going on for 75 years. It has to stop. You can be part of making that happen by staying informed and active.
APAN is a proud supporter of 3CR.
Professor, one of the things that settlers do, and it certainly happened on this continent, was to introduce foreign fauna. And it contributes to bushfires here, and how the indigenous people used to care for the land has created an environment locally here where we have amongst the highest summer bushfires. I know that similarly, if you can speak to the situation there with Zionist colonizers trying to turn Palestine into the Alps, but also the war on Palestinian agriculture, but on za'atar and sage, and trying to disconnect us from that.
Right. Yesterday I had a meeting with the Parks Victoria group of specialists in the environment here in Australia, and they were telling me about the hundreds of European plant species that were introduced in this country, and the destruction of the habitats, the destruction of the trees, the logging, the coal mines, etc. They educated me, and it's uncanny similarities to what happened in Palestine with the Zionist colonization of Palestine. I'll give you just a couple of examples on this front. When Israel destroyed some 534 Palestinian villages and towns, ethnically cleansing their people, they didn't just destroy the houses. They bulldozed the trees around the villages. That includes both domestic trees and wild trees. Millions of trees were uprooted. Domestic trees like olives and figs and almonds, and wild trees like oaks and hawthorn and carobs. And what did they do instead of that? They planted Pinus halepensis, a European pine tree. And nothing against Pinus halepensis. It's more suitable to northern Europe and climates of Europe. In a dry climate like ours, like you said happened in Australia, these pine trees are susceptible to fires, and we get fires all the time in the pine plantations. It's a monoculture. They also shed acidic leaves that prevent the undergrowth, so they are very destructive to biodiversity, the local biodiversity. As I said, they're more suitable in Europe than they are in Palestine. But this is just one example of the destruction of a landscape, destruction of biodiversity, to create a European look to the area, which is the same as happened here or in other places where Europeans went and settled and created those colonial societies. This destruction of our habitats and our environment continues to this day. And our role as indigenous people, of course, our destiny has been to resist this. And we have been resisting it since day one, basically, and to stick to our land, to try to maintain the original structure of the land, the original fauna and flora. We are the custodians of the land, whether one believes in God or not, this is our destiny, so to speak, and that's what we do, and we try to, and we have been doing, I wrote a whole book about the subject called Popular Resistance in Palestine, subtitled The History of Hope and Empowerment, and it is a history of hope and empowerment. It's not a history of defeat. We are not defeated people. Neither do I believe the Aboriginal people in Australia are defeated. They are still resisting, and I've visited with so many of them. And I feel that spirit of resistance and that spirit of connectivity to the land that survives against all odds.
Indeed. And those pine forests, and there's a couple that are named after Australian Prime Ministers, those pine forests are actually planted on top of those villages in another form of erasure.
Absolutely. They are to cover up their crime. And ironically, when the fires rage through them, as they inevitably do, they expose, for example, the Palestinian agricultural terraces that are thousands of years old, stone terraces where the Palestinians had planted originally olive trees and figs and almonds and things like that, as happened in West Jerusalem, even near Lifta and near Dar Yassin, villages in West Jerusalem that were depopulated. The fires actually kind of exposed the underlying
the truth
attempt, the truth, yes.
Yeah. And it was similar here. A couple of years ago, we had some particularly large fires, not unnormal, but these were quite big, and they exposed some indigenous farming techniques and water diversion and what would have been little farmlets for fisheries that were tens of thousands of years old, but had been lost in the colonization, the agricultural colonization of the land.
Right. I actually received a gift from an Aboriginal person in Perth who gave me a book called The Black Emu, and I'm reading that now, and it's a remarkable book about this issue of cultivating yams here and the changing of courses of irrigation channels and things like that. And you see again, the remarkable similarity. And, well, actually, it's not remarkable. I mean, when you think about it, colonialism is colonialism.
It's only got one language.
There's only one language. It's not to be unexpected that there are similarities and the same language is used even. The language, that also colonizers use is remarkable, like defending ourselves. The savages, the terrorists, the barbarians that are attacking us. Uncivilized people, and we're bringing civilization and technology to them. The same kind of language is used throughout the world. I lived in the U.S. and North America. I lived in... I went to South Africa, visited there, and I saw the colonization of the Dutch and the British colonization of South Africa and how that happened. And I visited like 45 countries, and every single one of them has a history of colonization. So we see the same pattern repeated over and over again, the same language, the same propaganda, the same...
theft,
idiocy, same destruction of the environment. And our role is to resist that, of course, and to now connect these struggles together, because we're at a point that this colonization is going to lead to another global war, and this time this global war is not going to spare anybody. There will not be winners and losers in it. There will be only losers, which is the whole planet, basically. So that's also why, people in this continent that I'm visiting need to be aware that if they just keep listening to their politicians and to the American run and Zionist-run media and are duped into a war in the Pacific with China, on Russia and Iran on one side, and the U.S., Australia, and NATO on the other side, we're all going to be losers. Nobody is going to be a winner.
No, nobody's going to be a winner. Professor, I've read some stories, and our Falahi women who have for hundreds and thousands of years have tended to wild herbs and spices, and the war now on that, how much they can cultivate, the laws that the Israelis have placed to protect, quote unquote, those herbs for the environment, but to strip us of ancient cooking techniques and herbs and spices as a policy of further agricultural Nakba.
What we observed here in so-called Australia is the same pattern also as what's happening in Palestine now, and that is to try and disconnect people from from their heritage, from their culture, from their background, from using indigenous material and organic produce, and to try and reshape the remaining people to be mentally colonized and westernized, if you want. In our situation, it's an interesting phenomena. Israel dubs itself as a green country, when in reality it has been one of the most destructive colonial states in terms of the environment. I'll give you just a simple example relating to this question of using medicinal herbs and also harvesting things from the wild. My mother used to take me as a child to the valleys, and we'd pick what we want to eat and what we want to, when I had a headache, there is a medicine for that. When I had a stomach ache, a medicine for that. Those are herbal medicines. So that's our tradition, that's our culture, is connectivity to the land and living off the land while protecting the land. The Zionists, what they did is remarkable. They said there are so-called protected areas or nature reserves. And they brag around the world that they have the highest percentage of land of Palestine, which they call Israel now, as quote-unquote green areas. It turns out who decides those green areas and what are they used for? It turns out who decides them is the Jewish National Fund, which employs zero number of biologists or ecologists or environmentalists or anything like that. And it is decided strictly for the use of exclusion of native people, indigenous people. So they arrest people, for example, picking wild oregano, za'atar, as we call it, from the fields like in South Hebron Hills, because, quote unquote, it's a nature reserve and we have to protect it. Well, but these people have been harvesting za'atar for thousands of years. It has not impacted the za'atar population. But ironically, in the same area, what does Israel do? In the same supposed green area, protected area, they have also a military firing zone 918 in the South Hebron Hills. And they use it, they run tanks and they bomb it from the air. So it is not about nature reserve. The ruse of using it as a nature reserve is strictly just a BS, to say that we use it to exclude natives. The more important is to use the land for colonial use, whether it's for military training zones or to use it for residential buildings for colonial settlers, or even for industrial settlements. They've done industrial settlements in the middle of so-called nature reserves. This is the irony of Israel claiming that they are a green country. They're one of the worst countries in terms of destruction of the environment, which is making the Palestine that used to be, as I said, part of the Fertile Crescent, very fertile country, with rich biodiversity. We have more plant species in Palestine before 1948 than exists in the whole of England. And Palestine is a very tiny country of 27,000 square kilometers. So, to do this, to claim that they are greening the country while doing the opposite, making a fertile green country a desert, and bombing it to smithereens is the biggest lie that is told about our people and our land.
Yeah. And settler colonialism and genocide manifest.
Right.
Professor Mazin, it's been an honour having you on our show. Thank you very much. We wish you the very best for the rest of your tour. And we thank Free Palestine Melbourne for making you available to us. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
You were joined today by Professor Mazin Qumsiyeh, who is here from Palestine on a tour. Be sure to share the podcast, tell your friends, and remember, there's never been a better time for a free Palestine.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.